A warehouse bully said, "You should have stayed dead." Then Stallone walked through the door. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The scent of industrial-grade cleaner and simmering anxiety hung heavy in the air of the cavernous warehouse, a place where the relentless hum of machinery and the shouts of foremen usually drowned out any subtler, more human sounds. Elias Thorne, a man whose own life was a study in quiet contemplation, felt like an anachronism amidst the clatter and the grime. He was here on a personal errand, picking up a custom-milled piece of lumber for a restoration project, a task that had brought him to this unfamiliar, utilitarian landscape. He stood near the foreman's office, a glass-walled cube raised above the warehouse floor, waiting for his order to be processed. His gaze, as always, was observant, taking in the intricate ballet of forklifts, the rhythmic movements of the workers on the line, the subtle hierarchies of authority and deference that governed this small, self-contained world. In his pocket, his fingers found the familiar, cool smoothness of a tarnished silver dollar, a memento from his father, a man who had worked in a place much like this, a man who had understood the quiet dignity of a hard day's labor and the often unseen burdens carried by those who performed it. His attention was drawn to a scene unfolding near the main loading bay. A young man, perhaps in his late 20s, was being berated by a florid-faced, barrel-chested supervisor. The young man, whose name Elias would later learn was Leo, stood at a rigid, almost military, attention, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over the supervisor's shoulder, his face a mask of stoic endurance. The supervisor, a man whose name tag read Harris, was jabbing a thick finger into Leo's chest, his voice a low, angry growl, though his words were lost in the ambient noise of the warehouse. Leo's posture, his quiet, unresisting acceptance of the verbal assault, spoke volumes to Elias. It was the posture of a man who had been trained to endure, to obey, to suppress his own reactions in the face of authority. It was the posture of a soldier. After a final, particularly vicious-sounding snarl from Harris, the supervisor stormed off, leaving Leo standing alone, a solitary, almost invisible figure amidst the bustling activity of the warehouse. Leo remained at attention for a long moment, his shoulders still squared, his gaze still fixed on that distant, unseen point. Then, as if a string had been cut, his posture collapsed. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and he leaned heavily against a stack of pallets, his body trembling with a mixture of suppressed rage, humiliation, and a profound, bone-deep weariness. Elias watched, his heart aching with a familiar, quiet anger. He had seen this before, this casual abuse of power, this thoughtless cruelty inflicted by those in positions of authority on those they perceived as subordinate, as less than. The silver dollar in his pocket felt heavy, a silent testament to his father's belief in the fundamental dignity of all honest labor, a dignity that was being so carelessly, so cruelly, violated before his eyes. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep within him, that he could not simply walk away, could not leave this young man to bear his humiliation in silence, alone. He waited until the foreman in the glass-walled office had finished with his paperwork and had given Elias a curt nod, indicating his order was ready. Then, instead of heading towards the lumberyard, Elias began to walk slowly, deliberately, towards the loading bay, towards the solitary, slumped figure of the young man whose quiet dignity had just been so brutally, so publicly assaulted. The hum of the machinery seemed to fade as he approached, his focus entirely on the quiet drama unfolding in this forgotten corner of the vast, indifferent warehouse. Elias approached Leo slowly, his footsteps making little sound on the dusty concrete floor. He didn't want to startle the young man, who was still leaning against the pallets, his head in his hands, his body radiating a palpable aura of despair. "Tough day?" Elias asked, his voice low, calm, non-intrusive. Leo's head snapped up, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, wide with surprise, then quickly guarded, defensive. He clearly expected further criticism, or perhaps unwanted pity. He straightened up, his military posture automatically reasserting itself, a shield against further emotional assault. "I'm fine," he said, his voice clipped, dismissive. "Just taking a break." "Sometimes," Elias observed gently, "a break is the only thing that keeps us from breaking." He paused, then added, "That was a harsh dressing down you took from your supervisor." "Unwarranted, from what I could see." Leo stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that anyone had noticed or cared. He's a tough boss," Leo mumbled, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He expects a lot." "There's a difference between being a tough boss and being a bully son," Elias said, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a firm, unwavering conviction. "And there's a difference between high expectations and a deliberate attempt to humiliate, to demean." He saw a flicker of something in Leo's eyes, a raw, unguarded pain that the young man quickly tried to suppress. "He doesn't know," Leo whispered, more to himself than to Elias. "He doesn't know anything." "Know what, Leo?" Elias prompted gently. Leo hesitated, then a wave of bitterness, of a long-suppressed anger, seemed to wash over him. "He was yelling at me because I was a few minutes late this morning. My leg was acting up. The prosthetic." He gestured almost imperceptibly towards his right leg. Elias's gaze followed the gesture, and for the first time, he noticed the slight, almost invisible unevenness in Leo's stance, the subtle way he favored his left leg. The invisible wound, Elias thought, made manifest. "Harris said, if I couldn't handle the job, I should have just stayed home. He said maybe I should have just stayed dead over there with the rest of the heroes." The words, when they finally came out, were a raw, ragged whisper, thick with a pain so profound it was almost a physical entity in the air between them. Elias felt a surge of cold, righteous fury, a rage so intense it almost took his breath away. The casual, monstrous cruelty of Harris's words, the utter, absolute desecration of a soldier's sacrifice, was almost beyond comprehension. The silver dollar in his pocket felt like a burning coal. He thought of his own brother, of the flag-draped coffin, of the hollow, meaningless platitudes offered by politicians who had never known the true cost of the conflicts they so casually initiated. He looked at Leo, at the raw, naked pain in his young face, and he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this was an injustice he would not let stand. "Leo," Elias said, his voice low, steady, yet vibrating with a tightly controlled anger. No one has the right to speak to you that way. Not him. Not anyone." He placed a gentle, steadying hand on Leo's shoulder. "Your service, your sacrifice, that is a matter of honor, not a target for some ignorant bully's cruel remarks. And we," he added, his gaze shifting towards the glass-walled office where Harris was now laughing on the phone, oblivious, "we are going to make sure he understands that." Leo looked at him, a mixture of fear and a dawning, fragile hope in his eyes. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have a quiet word with Mr. Harris," Elias replied, his voice a calm, dangerous promise. A quiet word about respect, about dignity, and about the profound, unforgivable ignorance of his words. Elias left Leo by the loading bay, his quiet promise hanging in the air, and began to walk towards the foreman's office, his stride deliberate, purposeful. The usual clamor of the warehouse seemed to recede, his focus entirely on the glass-walled cube where Harris, the supervisor, sat, his back to the floor, still laughing into his phone. Elias climbed the short flight of metal stairs, his footsteps echoing slightly in the relative quiet. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside. Harris looked up, his laughter dying in his throat, his expression shifting from amusement to annoyance at the intrusion. "Yeah? What do you want?" he demanded, his tone brusque, dismissive. "I'm on a call here." "I suggest you hang up," Elias said, his voice quiet, calm, yet carrying an authority that made Harris pause, his hand hovering over the phone's cradle. "My name is Elias Thorne, and we need to discuss your management style, specifically as it pertains to the young man you were just berating on the warehouse floor." "Thou," Harris's eyes narrowed. "Look, pal," he sneered, his arrogance returning. "Who the hell are you? And what business is it of yours how I manage my employees?" That kid was late. He got what was coming to him. "What was coming to him, Mr. Harris?" Elias countered, his voice still low but now edged with a cold, hard anger. A lecture on punctuality? Or a suggestion that he should have stayed dead? The color drained from Harris's florid face. He slammed the phone down. "Who told you that? Did that little punk come crying to you?" "He didn't have to come crying to me, Mr. Harris," Elias replied, taking a step closer, his presence seeming to fill the small, cramped office. "I have ears, and I have a conscience. Two things you appear to be sorely lacking." He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of Harris's cluttered desk. "That little punk, as you so eloquently put it, is a veteran. He lost his leg serving a country that you, in your comfortable, climate-controlled office, seem to take for granted. His tardiness this morning was due to the pain from his prosthetic, a constant, physical reminder of a sacrifice you can't even begin to comprehend." Harris stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerged. He looked, for the first time, genuinely stunned, his usual bluster completely deserting him. "And you," Elias continued, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you, in your profound ignorance and your casual cruelty, chose to mock that sacrifice. You chose to tell a man who has given a part of himself for his country that he would have been better off dead." He paused, letting the full, monstrous weight of Harris's words settle in the small, suddenly silent office. "There are no words, Mr. Harris," Elias said, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper, yet carrying the force of a physical blow, to adequately describe the depth of that disrespect. "It is not just an insult to Leo. It is an insult to every man and woman who has ever worn a uniform, who has ever faced danger, who has ever borne the wounds, both seen and unseen, of conflict. It is an act of profound, unforgivable moral cowardice." Harris seemed to shrink in his chair, his earlier, overbearing physicality collapsing into a small, pathetic heap. He looked like a man who had just been forced to look into a mirror and had been horrified by the reflection he saw there. The silver dollar in Elias's pocket felt cool, solid, a silent testament to the simple, unadorned dignity of his own father, a man who would have been appalled by Harris's behavior. The lesson, Elias knew, was just beginning. Harris continued to stare at Elias, his face a mask of disbelief, his usual blustering confidence completely shattered. He seemed to be struggling to process the quiet, yet devastating, indictment Elias had just delivered. I didn't know," he finally stammered, his voice a hoarse, barely audible croak. "I didn't know he was a vet, or that he lost a leg. And would it have mattered if you had known, Mr. Harris?" Elias countered, his voice still low, still firm. "Would that have made him more deserving of your respect, your basic human decency? Or is that a courtesy you only extend to those whose stories you happen to be aware of?" He paused, then continued, his gaze unwavering. "A man's worth, Mr. Harris, is not determined by his physical wholeness, nor by his ability to adhere to a rigid timetable. It is determined by his character, by his integrity, by the sacrifices he has made. And by that measure, Leo is a giant, and you, sir, are a very, very small man." Harris flinched as if struck. He looked away, unable to meet Elias's steady, penetrating gaze. He seemed to be wrestling with a profound, uncomfortable sense of shame, a feeling he was clearly unaccustomed to. What do you want from me?" Harris mumbled, his voice filled with a new, unfamiliar note of defeat. "I want you to understand, Mr. Harris," Elias replied. "I want you to understand the weight of your words, the profound hurt they can inflict. And I want you to do what any decent human being would do in this situation. I want you to find Leo, and I want you to apologize. Not a quick, dismissive apology, but a genuine, heartfelt one. I want you to look him in the eye and acknowledge the profound disrespect you have shown him and the service he represents." He then did something that seemed to surprise Harris even more. He reached into his pocket and took out the tarnished silver dollar. He placed it on the desk between them, its metallic surface gleaming dully under the office's harsh fluorescent lights. This, Elias said, his voice softening slightly, belonged to my father. He worked in a place much like this one, a place of hard labor, of sweat, of quiet, everyday struggles. He was not a soldier, but he was a man of immense integrity. He taught me that every person, regardless of their station, regardless of their circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity. He taught me that respect is not something to be earned through status or power, but something that is owed, fundamentally, from one human being to another. He pushed the silver dollar gently across the desk towards Harris. Perhaps, he said, you should hold on to this for a while. As a reminder of the simple, yet profound, value of a hard day's work, of a life lived with honor, of the quiet dignity that resides in every human soul, if only we have the eyes to see it. Harris stared at the silver dollar, then up at Elias, his own eyes now filled with a mixture of shame, confusion, and a dawning, reluctant understanding. The quiet, unassuming man before him had not just challenged his authority. He had challenged his very soul, his fundamental understanding of the world. And in that quiet, glass-walled office, amidst the clamor of the indifferent warehouse, a profound, uncomfortable, and perhaps transformative lesson was beginning to take root. Harris sat frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on the old silver dollar resting on his desk. It seemed to radiate a quiet, reproachful energy, a silent testament to a world of values he had long ignored or dismissed. The usual noises of the warehouse, the beep of a reversing forklift, the clang of metal on metal, the distant shouts of workers, seemed to fade into a muted, irrelevant hum. The only reality, in that moment, was the small, cramped office, the quiet, unwavering presence of the man who stood before him, and the immense, crushing weight of his own shame. He thought of his own father, a man who had worked in a factory his entire life, his hands calloused, his back bent, a man who had spoken little but had embodied a quiet, unshakable integrity. What would his father think of him now, of the man he had become, a man who used his small measure of power to belittle, to humiliate, a man who had told a wounded soldier he would have been better off dead? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the last vestiges of his self-justification from him. He looked up at Elias, his eyes, for the first time, holding not anger or defiance, but a raw, genuine remorse. "You're right," he said, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. You're absolutely right. What I said, it was monstrous. There's no excuse for it. No excuse at all." He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a sudden, convulsive sob. It was a sound of profound, utter self-disgust, the sound of a man's carefully constructed self-image shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Elias watched him, his own expression softening. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Harris's breakdown. He felt only a deep, sorrowful empathy. He knew that this moment of painful self-awareness, this confrontation with one's own moral failings, was a necessary, if agonizing, step towards any kind of genuine change, any kind of redemption. He waited for Harris's sobs to subside, his silence a quiet, unjudging presence. Finally, Harris raised his head, his face streaked with tears, his eyes red-rimmed, his earlier, florid complexion now a pale, sickly gray. I have to fix this," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. I have to make it right." "Yes, you do, Mr. Harris," Elias said gently. "You do." Harris fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling so badly he could barely operate it. He punched in a number, then spoke into the receiver, his voice still shaky but now imbued with a new, desperate urgency. "Give me Mr. Sterling," he said, referring to the owner of the company. "Now, it's an emergency." While he waited, he looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and a dawning, hesitant gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not letting me get away with it. For making me see." Elias simply nodded. He knew that his work here was almost done. He had been a catalyst, a mirror, a quiet voice of conscience. The rest, the difficult, necessary work of apology, of atonement, of change, now rested with Harris himself. The door to the office opened, and Leo stood there, his expression a mixture of apprehension and a quiet, defiant dignity. He had clearly been summoned by Harris. Harris looked at Leo, and his face crumpled again. He rose slowly from his chair, a large, broken man, and walked around the desk until he was standing before the young veteran. "Leo," Harris began, his voice a raw, aching sound, "I am so sorry for what I said, for how I treated you. It was unforgivable. And I hope, someday, you can find it in your heart to forgive me." He then did something that stunned both Leo and Elias. He reached out, not to shake Leo's hand, but to place a hand gently on his shoulder, a gesture of profound, humbled respect. "You, son," Harris said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "are a better man than I am. A far, far better man." The apology so raw, so genuine, so utterly stripped of all pretense, hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful, and profoundly healing thing. Leo stood in the doorway of the small office, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He had clearly expected another tirade, another round of humiliation, to be met instead with this raw, broken apology from the man who had so cruelly berated him just a short while ago. Was a disorienting, almost surreal experience. He looked from Harris's tear-streaked, contrite face to Elias's quiet, steady presence, then back to Harris. He didn't speak immediately. He seemed to be processing the sudden, dramatic shift in the emotional landscape. Harris, his hand still resting on Leo's shoulder, seemed to be waiting for a verdict, a judgment. His usual blustering authority was gone, replaced by a raw, almost childlike, vulnerability. I accept your apology, Mr. Harris," Leo finally said, his voice quiet but clear, devoid of any triumph or malice. There was only a simple, profound dignity in his tone. "Thank you." The two words, so simple, yet so powerful, seemed to release a tension that had been coiled in the small office. Harris let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of immense, cathartic relief. He took his hand from Leo's shoulder and stepped back, wiping his eyes with the back of a beefy hand. Just then, the phone on Harris's desk buzzed, a sharp, insistent sound. Harris, still looking shaken, picked it up. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice still a little unsteady. "Yes, sir, I have something I need to report, and an incident, and a serious error in my own judgment." He listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, sir. I understand. I'll be right up." He hung up the phone and looked at Elias and Leo, his expression a mixture of dread and a strange, new resolve. "Mr. Sterling wants to see me," he said. "Now." He then looked at Leo, a new, profound respect in his eyes. "Leo," he said, would you be willing to come with me? To tell Mr. Sterling what happened? From your perspective? I think he needs to hear it. From you." Leo hesitated for a moment, then looked at Elias, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "Yes, sir," Leo said, his voice steady, his posture straightening, the quiet dignity of the soldier once again asserting itself. "I will." Elias watched as the two men, the chastened supervisor and the quiet, resilient veteran, left the office together, their steps in an unlikely, yet hopeful, sync. They were on their way to face the company owner, to account for the day's events, to begin the difficult, necessary process of institutional, as well as personal, reckoning. Elias knew that the conversation with Mr. Sterling would be a difficult one, but he also knew that something important, something fundamental, had shifted in that warehouse today. A voice of cruelty had been silenced, and a voice of quiet dignity had been heard. A man of power had been humbled, and a man of quiet courage had been affirmed. He picked up the old silver dollar from Harris's desk. He turned it over in his fingers, its weight a familiar, reassuring presence. His father would have been proud, he thought. Proud of the way a simple, fundamental principle, the principle of respect, of human dignity, had, in the end, triumphed over arrogance and indifference. He placed the coin back in his pocket. His work here was done. He had been a quiet observer, a gentle catalyst, a witness to a small but profound drama of human frailty and redemption. And that, for Elias Thorne, was always a day well spent. Elias made his way out of the foreman's office and back onto the noisy, cavernous floor of the warehouse. The rhythmic clang and hum of the machinery, which had earlier seemed so oppressive, now felt like a familiar, almost comforting backdrop to the quiet, internal drama he had just witnessed. He saw Leo and Harris walking together towards the main administrative building, their figures small against the vast industrial landscape. They were an unlikely pair, their shared journey born of a moment of profound disrespect. Yet now, perhaps, heading toward the place of unexpected understanding, of mutual respect. Elias didn't follow them. He knew that the next chapter of this story belonged to them, to be navigated in the quiet, often intimidating offices of corporate power. He had planted the seed. It was up to them to see that it was nurtured, that it grew into something meaningful, something lasting. He found his way to the lumberyard, where his order, a small stack of beautifully milled, fragrant cedar planks, was waiting for him. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool surface of the wood, its natural, unadorned beauty a welcome contrast to the harsh, metallic environment of the warehouse. He thought of the restoration project that awaited him, a delicate, painstaking process of bringing an old, neglected piece of furniture back to life, of honoring its history, its craftsmanship, its inherent worth. It was a fitting metaphor, he mused, for what had transpired today. A human spirit, neglected, dishonored, had been offered a chance at restoration, a chance to have its own inherent worth seen, acknowledged, and respected. As he was loading the planks into his old, reliable pickup truck, he saw a figure approaching him. It was the young woman from the front office, the one who had processed his initial order. She had a hesitant, almost shy, expression on her face. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice a little uncertain. "Yes," Elias replied, offering her a gentle smile. I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before meeting his again. "For what you did. For Leo. We all heard what Harris said to him. It was awful, but no one ever stands up to Harris. We're all afraid of him. Fear," Elias said softly, "is a powerful silencer. But courage, my dear, can be contagious." The young woman smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Well," she said, "you were certainly courageous today. You made a difference. For Leo. And maybe for all of us." She then hurried back towards the office, leaving Elias with a quiet sense of warmth, of a connection made, of a small but significant ripple effect. He finished loading his lumber, the silver dollar in his pocket a cool, reassuring weight. He had come to this warehouse for a simple, practical purpose, but he was leaving with something far more valuable. A renewed faith in the power of a quiet, principled stand, a reminder that even in the most unlikely of places, the most hardened of hearts, the seeds of empathy, of respect, of a shared, fundamental humanity could indeed be planted, could indeed, with a little courage, a little grace, begin to grow. He started the engine of his old truck, its familiar rumble, a comforting sound. As he pulled out of the warehouse complex and back onto the city streets, he felt a sense of quiet, profound peace. The world was still a complex, often difficult place. But today, in one small corner of it, a measure of justice had been served, a measure of dignity had been restored. And for Elias Thorne, that was more than enough. The drive home was a quiet, contemplative one. The city, which had seemed so gray and indifferent earlier, now appeared to Elias in a softer, more nuanced light. He thought of Leo, of his quiet endurance in the face of Harris's tirade, of the profound, unspoken pain he carried in the memory of his service, in the reality of his physical wound. He hoped that the events of the day, the unexpected apology, the validation from the company owner, would be a balm to his spirit, a step on a long, difficult road to healing. And he thought of Harris, the blustering, arrogant supervisor, brought low not by a threat or a show of force, but by a quiet, unwavering appeal to his own buried conscience. Elias didn't believe in easy transformations, in sudden, miraculous conversions. He knew that true change was a slow, arduous process, but he also believed in the possibility of redemption, in the capacity of every human being to recognize their own failings, to choose a different, better path. Perhaps Harris, with the old silver dollar now resting on his desk as a constant, quiet reminder, would begin that journey. Perhaps he would learn to see the men and women who worked for him not as cogs in a machine, but as individuals, each with their own stories, their own burdens, their own inherent dignity. It was a hope, Elias knew, but a hope worth holding on to. When he arrived back at his small, book-lined apartment, he carefully unloaded the cedar planks, their clean, fragrant scent a welcome antidote to the industrial grime of the warehouse. He placed them in his workshop, a small, cluttered space that was his sanctuary, his haven of quiet creation. He took the silver dollar from his pocket and placed it on his workbench, next to the tarnished bronze star that had belonged to his brother. Two simple, metallic objects, each a symbol of a different kind of value, a different kind of strength. One represented the quiet dignity of honest labor, the other the profound sacrifice of selfless service. Together, they seemed to tell a story of the fundamental, interconnected worth of all human endeavor. He sat for a long time in his worn armchair, the silence of his apartment a welcome embrace. He thought of the unseen, often unacknowledged, battles that were fought every day, not on foreign fields, but in workplaces, in schools, in the quiet, ordinary spaces of our lives. The battles for respect, for dignity, for a simple acknowledgement of our shared humanity. These, he knew, were the battles that truly defined us, that shaped the character of our communities, of our world. And he knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that he would continue to be a witness to these battles, a quiet champion for the overlooked, the dismissed, the forgotten. It was not a role he had chosen, but one that had chosen him, one that was as much a part of him as the memories he carried, the principles he lived by. The world, for all its noise and its fury, was also a place of quiet courage, of unexpected grace, of the enduring, resilient power of the human spirit. And Elias Thorne, the quiet historian, the unassuming guardian of forgotten narratives, was content to be a humble, grateful observer of it all. A few weeks later, Elias received an unexpected letter in the mail. The envelope was of a high quality, the return address simply that of the corporate headquarters of the company that owned the warehouse. Intrigued, he opened it. Inside was a short, formally typed letter from Mr. Sterling, the owner, and a small, enclosed check. "Dear Mr. Thorne," the letter began, "I am writing to thank you again for your intervention at our facility several weeks ago. The incident involving Mr. Harris and the young veteran, Leo, prompted a company-wide review of our management training and our policies regarding the treatment of all our employees, particularly our veteran workforce. We have since implemented a new, mandatory sensitivity and respect training program for all supervisory staff, a program that emphasizes the values of dignity, empathy, and understanding that you so eloquently embodied." Elias read on, a slow, surprised smile spreading across his face. "As a result of your actions," the letter continued, "we have also established a new partnership with a local veteran support organization to provide better resources and support for our employees who have served. The enclosed check is a donation to that organization, made in your name, as a small token of our gratitude for the profound and much-needed lesson you taught us." Elias looked at the check. The amount was substantial. He felt a profound sense of humility, of a quiet, unexpected vindication. His small, personal intervention had created ripples he could never have anticipated, leading to a real, tangible, institutional change that would benefit countless others. He thought of Leo and of Harris. He hoped they were both finding their way, their own paths to healing and to a new, more respectful understanding. He thought of his father and his brother and the simple, powerful values they had represented. The letter from Mr. Sterling was a testament to the enduring power of those values, a reminder that a single, principled voice could indeed, sometimes, move mountains, or at least the entrenched hierarchies of a corporate structure. He folded the letter and placed it on his desk, next to the bronze star and the silver dollar. They were a trinity of symbols now, each representing a different facet of the human story. The sacrifice of the soldier, the dignity of the worker, and now, the possibility of corporate conscience, of a system choosing to evolve towards a more humane, more respectful way of being. The world, Elias reflected, was still a flawed, often difficult place. But it was also a place of surprising, hopeful transformations. And he was grateful, profoundly grateful, to have been a small, quiet part of one of them. The story of what happened at the warehouse became, for Elias, another quiet touchstone in his life's journey. It was a powerful reminder that the battles for dignity and respect were not confined to any single arena, but were fought everywhere, from the battlefields of foreign lands to the concrete floors of industrial workplaces. He forwarded the donation from Mr. Sterling to the Veterans Organization, along with an anonymous note suggesting it be used to support employment and mental health services for veterans like Leo. He sought no credit, no recognition. The quiet satisfaction of knowing he had been a catalyst for positive change was reward enough. He never returned to the warehouse. He had no reason to. His part in that particular story was over. But he often thought of the people he had encountered there, of Leo with his quiet resilience, of Harris with his painful but necessary awakening, of the young woman in the office with her quiet courage, and even of Mr. Sterling, the man of power who had shown himself capable of listening, of learning, of changing course. These were the quiet, often unseen, dramas that truly shaped the world, Elias believed. Not the grand pronouncements of politicians or the bold strategies of generals, but the small individual choices made every day by ordinary people. The choice to speak up or to remain silent, to offer a hand or to turn away, to choose empathy over indifference, respect over contempt. As the seasons turned and the memory of that rainy afternoon at the warehouse began to fade, Elias continued his quiet work, his solitary rambles, his chronicling of the forgotten stories of human courage. He knew that the world would always present new challenges, new injustices, new opportunities to stand for the values he held dear. And he would be ready, as he always was, armed not with power or with wealth, but with the simple, enduring strength of his own moral compass, a compass that had been calibrated by a lifetime of listening to the quiet, often heartbreaking, but ultimately hopeful, music of the human heart. The silver dollar remained on his desk, a constant, quiet reminder of his father's legacy, and of a day when a lesson in dignity had been delivered and received in the most unlikely of places. And that, for Elias Thorne, was a story worth preserving, a truth worth holding on to, always.